What would you do if the house you had scrubbed and mended since childhood cast you out at dusk for a theft you did not commit, and left you with nothing but a battered tin box your father had once called the only thing worth keeping? In Renfield, at the tail end of a wet autumn, 21-year-old Susan Mason was turned from the servants' door of Halden Hall with the word thief pinned to her back and a dead man's small, locked box pressed under her arm. They meant it as ruin. They meant the box as a joke. But what waited inside the shuttered rooms and the damp cellar her father had guarded all his life would rewrite every whispered word against her. Settle in. Let us know from which quiet corner of the world you are listening tonight, and stay close. For this is a story that begins in disgrace and ends in a light no one in Renfield expected to see. The lane out of Halden ran downhill between two dripping hedgerows, and Susan Mason walked it without looking back. The gravel had gone to slurry in the day's rain. Her boots, patched twice at the toe, took on the cold at once. She carried a bundle in a gray shawl, a change of linen, a comb of her mother's, a prayer book with the spine gone soft, and under her other arm the tin box, no larger than a loaf, its lid dented, its little lock rusted shut. Behind her, the great chimneys of the hall smoked into a low sky. Ahead of her, the village of Renfield lay half a mile down, its slates dark, its lamps not yet lit. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the scullery, silently, into a folded cloth, while the housekeeper counted spoons at the deal table, and Mrs. Halden's voice rose and fell in the passage above like a bell tolling something she could not undo. 6 pieces of silver, a sugar tongs, 2 salt spoons, a christening cup, a snuff box, a small figured ladle, gone from the plate room between Michaelmas and All Souls. Susan had polished every one of them since she was 14. She could have named the maker's marks in the dark. She had said so quietly when Mr. Roderick Halden pointed his long finger at her across the servants' hall. He had laughed. Then he had stopped laughing, and the laughing had passed to his mother, and then to the new footman. And then it had emptied out of the room and become a silence Susan understood too well. The stones of the churchyard wall rose on her right as she came down. She let one hand brush the wet moss on the coping. Her father had walked her along this same wall when she was 7, showing her the little iron cross where his own father lay, telling her the names of the yews, telling her that a person's name was a lamp, easy to blow out, hard to relight, and worth the labor. She had not understood him then. She understood him now. At the foot of the lane, the loyal figure of Mr. Bram Folks stood waiting under the eaves of the smithy, cap in hand. He had been her father's friend for 30 years. His face was red from the forge and grave as a stone. "Susan," he said. "Mr. Folks. You'll not sleep in the open?" "No. Come." That was all. He shouldered her bundle without another word and led her round the back way to the low room above his workshop, where a coal fire had been laid and a bowl of barley broth set on the hob. He did not ask what had happened. In Renfield, the news had run ahead of her feet, as bad news always did, and Bram Folks had already made up his mind whom to believe. He set a stool for her by the hearth, poured the broth, and left her to eat. She ate slowly, the tin box she set on the deal table beside her, where the firelight caught its dents. Her father had given it to her the winter he died, 3 years back, on the last clear morning he had strength to speak. "Keep this," he had said. His voice had been thin as paper by then. "Keep it whether they ask or not. Do not open it in the hall. Do not open it in company. Only when they come for your name, Susan. Only then." She had thought it fever talk. She had put the box under the loose board beneath her cot in the attic and forgotten it for months at a time. When they searched her chest that afternoon and found nothing, and Mrs. Halden had ordered every drawer turned out, Susan had gone up alone to fetch her bundle and lifted the board and taken the box down without a word. The housekeeper had seen it in her hand as she passed the plate room. She had laughed, a short, dry laugh, and said, "Let her keep her father's rubbish," and Mr. Roderick had echoed the laugh. And so the tin box had come with her down the muddy lane, while 6 pieces of silver stayed somewhere behind her that she could not name. Now, in Bram Folks's upper room, with the coals settling and the rain starting again on the slates, she turned the box in her hands. The little lock was rusted through. She could have broken it with a hairpin. She did not. Her father had said only when they come for your name. They had come for it today. Yet something in her, quiet and stubborn, wanted to be inside the walls of Halden Hall when she lifted the lid, inside the shuttered rooms, inside the damp cellar he had kept locked all his years as steward, inside the places he had walked her past as a child with one finger raised to his lips. She set the box down. She banked the fire. She did not sleep, but she rested, and while she rested, she began to plan. What sort of father hides a truth in a rusted tin and tells his daughter to open it only in the hour of her ruin? What could a servant in a country house have known and kept and been willing to leave in the hands of a girl of 7? And what waits in a cellar that a man locks every night of his working life? If a story like this holds you, tell me so in the comments below, and subscribe to walk the next mile with me. For tomorrow before dawn, Susan Mason means to go back into Halden Hall by a door no one has watched in 20 years. She did not sleep, but the small hours had a shape she remembered from childhood illness. The coals settling, the rain slackening, the slates ticking as they cooled. When the first thin grayness came into the little window above the workshop, she was already at the sill, watching the lane. She had meant to be up the hill and inside the walls of Halden Hall by that hour. She had meant to slip past the old laundry court, past the yard gate that hung on one hinge, past the low door beneath the coal chute that had not been opened, so far as she knew, since the last steward before her father. But when she went to the head of the stair, with the tin box against her ribs and her bundle in her hand, Bram Folks was already there in his leather apron with 2 nails in his teeth, and he shook his head at her once, very slowly, and she understood. He led her back to the fire. He set the nails on the mantel. He said, "They have sent to the constable." And then, after a long moment, he said, "Not today, girl. Show yourself in the square today. Let them see you have nowhere to hide." Susan sat on the stool. She did not answer. She placed the tin box on the deal table, and she folded her hands over it, and she waited. By the time the bells sounded 8, word of her disgrace had gone the length of Renfield and back. She heard it first through the shutters, in the voices of the 2 carters who came for a set of shoes. A low rumble about the Halden girl and the missing plate, and one of them saying, "Always the quiet ones," and the other laughing without any warmth. She heard it again from the baker's boy, who lingered at the smithy door with a basket on his arm and asked Bram straight out whether it was true that Mason's daughter had lifted the christening cup. Bram told the boy to mind his bread and closed the door in his face. At mid-morning, because Bram had said she must, Susan walked with him to the pump in the square with 2 tin pails. The rain had thinned to a fine wet air that clung to wool and beaded on the hedgerows. Renfield's market was half set out. A few baskets of turnips, a stand of dark apples, a woman selling eggs from a wicker tray. The talk stopped when Susan came into the square, and then it started again, lower, in the way water finds a new channel. A girl of 12, who had once given Susan a ribbon at the Michaelmas fair, turned her face into her mother's shawl. Two women by the egg stall looked at Susan the way one looks at a broken pane, with a small, unhappy interest, and no wish to go nearer. The chandler's wife, who had known Susan's mother, crossed herself and would not meet her eye. Susan filled her pails. She did not hurry. She did not look up. She had learned as a child, at her father's knee, that a person walking through weather and a person walking through talk should keep the same pace. She was lifting the second pail when Mr. Roderick Halden rode into the square on his bay gelding, with his coat unbuttoned and his color high. He drew rein 3 yards from the pump. He did not dismount. He looked down at her over the horse's shoulder with the loud, careless amusement of a man performing for a crowd he had not yet noticed was silent. "Still in the parish, Mason," he said. "I thought a thief would have run further by morning." Susan set the pail down. She did not speak. "You have my mother's christening cup somewhere," he said. "Under a floor, in a hedge, in that ridiculous tin." He gestured at the shawl bundle over her arm. His voice was pitched for the market. "When it turns up, girl, we will know where to look for the rest of you." The market did not laugh. That was the strange thing. A season ago, they would have laughed. This morning, the egg woman looked at her hands, and the chandler's wife looked at the cobbles, and the two carters at the smithy door turned back to their horses as though they had remembered urgent work. Mr. Roderick felt the shift and did not know what to do with it. He wheeled the gelding hard, threw a coin at the pump that rang and rolled and stopped by Susan's boot, and rode out of the square at a trot. Susan did not pick up the coin. She lifted her pails and turned for the smithy, and as she turned, an old woman stepped from the shadow of the market cross into her path. Mrs. Ainsley, the retired schoolmistress, who had taught Susan her letters in a low room above the vestry 12 years before, and who was now so bent she walked with 2 sticks and a boy to carry her basket. She wore black wool and a black bonnet, and a shawl the color of wet slate. Her eyes were very clear. She laid one gloved hand on Susan's sleeve, so lightly that Susan felt it more as warmth than as weight, and she spoke once, in the spare, formal cadence of a woman who had spent her life shaping sentences for children to remember. "What is locked below," she said, "outlives what is polished above." Then she took her hand away, and she nodded once as though a document had been signed between them, and her boy led her on across the square toward the churchyard gate. Susan stood with the pails in her hands and the water sloshing at her knees, and she did not understand a word of it, and she did not forget a word of it either. She carried the pails back to the smithy. She did not look behind her. She set them down inside the door. Bram, watching from the anvil, said only, "Good girl," and turned back to his work. That afternoon the rain came in earnest, and by 3 the lanes were running. Susan sat by the upper window with the tin box in her lap, and watched the light go out of Renfield an hour early. She waited. She counted the bells. At 6, when the last cart had gone home and the square was empty, and the lamplighter had passed with his long pole, she took up her shawl and her bundle and the tin box, and she went down the stair. Bram met her at the workshop door with a bull's-eye lantern he had trimmed low and a length of oiled sacking to wrap the box against the wet. He did not ask her where she meant to go. He said, "The Haldens dine at 7. The dogs are chained by 1/2 past. Go by the ice-house path. Come back before light or do not come back tonight at all." She nodded. He opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the running dark. The icehouse path climbed by way of the old orchard, behind the estate wall, where the apples had gone unpicked for 3 seasons, and the grass grew waist-high between the trees. The rain was steady and cold, and it found the seam at her collar within 100 yards and settled there for the rest of the climb. She walked with the lantern shuttered down to a slit, using the pale line of the wall as her guide. Halden Hall rose ahead of her out of the wet dusk in stages. First only the pitch of the roof against a sky 1 shade less black than the trees, then the twin chimneys of the west wing, then the great blind bulk of the shuttered south front, and at last, low down and half swallowed in ivy, the coal chute door she had come for. It was smaller than she remembered. Everything from childhood is. The iron ring was orange with rust, and the timber below it was green with damp, and the whole door leaned slightly out of true, as though the house had sagged a 1/4 inch toward the orchard in the years since anyone had thought to force it. She knelt in the wet leaves. She set the lantern between her knees. She worked the ring with both hands, slow at first, then harder, and at last, with a soft complaint that seemed loud enough to bring every dog in the county. The door gave inward and released a breath of cold air that smelled of coal, brick, standing water, and the faint, sweet, unmistakable damp of her father's cellar. She went in on her hands and knees and pulled the door closed behind her. Inside, the dark was total. She sat for a long moment on the packed earth of the chute with her back against the closed door, breathing the smell and letting her heart quiet. Then she opened the lantern's shutter to the width of a coin and lifted it. She was in a low brick passage no higher than her shoulder, sloping down toward the cellar proper. Coal dust lay in ridges along the floor where feet had once passed and no longer did. A rat's track ran through the dust and turned aside into a broken drain. Above her, very faintly, she could hear the house, a footfall 2 floors up, a voice that might have been the housekeeper's, the small metallic click of silverware being laid on a distant table for the 7 o'clock dinner. She crept forward until the passage opened, and then she stood and lifted the lantern properly and let the shutter open a hand's breadth. The cellar was as she had half remembered and half invented. Brick vaults, low and blackened, a stone floor uneven with old flags, a long deal table down the middle on which her father had once set out ledgers by candle, iron hooks in the beams, a wine bin along the far wall, mostly empty, the racks powdered with the dust of 30 years, and along the near wall, beneath a small barred window that showed only the black of the wet orchard, the row of cupboards her father had kept locked, 5 oak doors set flush into the brick, each with an iron plate, each with a keyhole, each, as she came near enough to lift the lantern to them, still locked. She stood a long minute and looked at those 5 doors, and for the first time since the housekeeper had counted spoons in the scullery, she was afraid. She had no key. She had never seen a key. Her father had carried his ring to his grave, and Mrs. Halden had ordered his ring melted down for scrap the week after the funeral. Susan had watched Bram Folks do it himself at the smithy, weeping quietly at the bellows. She set the lantern on the deal table. She set the tin box beside it. She sat on the low bench where her father had once sat to write, and she put her face in her hands. And she listened to the house breathe above her and the rain run down the outside of the barred window, and she did not weep. She had come inside the walls, as he had told her. She had brought the box, as he had told her, and the doors he had kept locked all his working life were still locked, and there was no key in Renfield, and no one to ask, and no light in the cellar but the slit of a lantern she dared not open further. She lowered her hands, She looked at the barred window. The wet orchard beyond it was the same black as the inside of the tin box in her father's last winter. She would sleep here, she decided, on the bench, with the box under her cheek and the lantern shuttered to nothing. She would not go back to the smithy tonight. She would live with the locked doors until the doors told her something. That was what her father had done for 30 years. That, she thought, was what a steward's daughter could do for one night. She lay down on her side on the bench. She drew the shawl over her shoulder. She rested one hand on the tin box, and one hand, without meaning to, on the cold brick of the wall beneath the nearest of the 5 locked doors, as though the door might, if she was patient, tell her the name of its key. She did not sleep so much as lie in a long gray shallow of half-thought, aware of the box under her cheek and of the slow ticking of water somewhere in the vaults. Once, near what she took to be the small hours, she heard the housekeeper cross the passage 2 floors above her, heavy on the heel, and pause a long moment at a door before moving on. Once she heard a dog bark from the stable yard and be hushed. Toward the end of the night, the rain slackened and the cellar filled with a colder silence, and it was in that silence that Susan became aware she was not alone. Something breathed, not the house. The house breathed differently, in beams and settling plaster. This was closer and low, and had the small, clean rhythm of a living thing. Susan opened her eyes without moving. The lantern was shuttered to nothing, but a poor gray had begun to reach the barred window from the orchard, enough to shape the deal table and the pale square of tin box beside her cheek. On the flagstones between the bench and the nearest cupboard door, a cat was sitting. He was old and heavy, with a coat gone the color of ash and one ear notched to a triangle. He sat quite square on his haunches with his tail folded neatly over his front paws, and he watched her without blinking, as though he had watched her for some time and had reached no conclusion he needed to act upon. Susan knew him at once. He had been her father's cellar cat when she was a child, kept for the rats, and he had been an old cat then. She had thought him dead these 7 years. He must have been closer to 20 than to any age a cat is meant to reach. "Barleycorn," she whispered. The cat's notched ear moved a quarter turn toward her voice. He did not come. He did not go. He sat where he was and watched, and after a while he laid himself down on the flagstone with his forelegs tucked under him and closed his eyes to slits and stayed. Susan sat up slowly on the bench. She unshuttered the lantern to the width of 2 coins, no more, and by that light she began, for the first time, to look properly at the cellar she had entered in the dark. The 5 oak doors were as she had left them, locked and mute. The wine bin was as she had left it. The deal table stood down the center of the room, with its old ink marks and its scored corner where her father had cut candles. The iron hooks in the beams held nothing but cobweb, and on the far side of the deal table, at the end nearest the cupboards, something on the wall caught the lantern in a way brick should not. She rose and crossed to it, careful of her boots on the flags. The wall between the 2nd and 3rd of the 5 doors was brick as the rest was brick, dark with damp and pale with the bloom of old lime. But at the height of her shoulder, cut small and shallow into a single brick, was a letter. An S, cut with the point of a nail, patient and clean, no larger than her thumbnail. Beneath it, in the same hand, a second letter. An M. Susan stood very still. Her father had never carved his name into anything. He had thought marks in wood and stone a kind of vanity, and had said so once in her hearing, to a groom who had scratched initials into a stall. And these were not his initials. These were hers. Susan Mason, cut into a brick in a cellar he had kept locked from every soul in the house for 30 years, at exactly the height a man of his height would carve without stooping. On the wall between the second and third of the doors, he had never opened in her sight. She did not touch it. She looked at it a long moment, then looked at the second door on its left and the third door on its right, and then looked down at the flagstone directly beneath the letters. The flagstone there was of the same gray as the others, but its edges were cleaner. The mortar around it was thinner. It had been lifted, and lifted more than once, and set back with the care of a man who did not want a housekeeper's eye to catch it. Barleycorn, from the far side of the table, opened his eyes fully and watched her. Susan did not kneel to the flagstone. She did not fetch a blade to the mortar. She had heard the household stirring above, a scullery door, a bucket set down, a woman's cough, and she knew the cellar would not be hers past sunrise. She shuttered the lantern to a slit, took up the tin box and her bundle, and stepped back from the wall. She marked the brick and the flagstone in her mind by counting the courses from the floor and the flags from the barred window. Then she went out as she had come, on her hands and knees through the coal-chute passage, and pulled the little door shut behind her, and walked down through the wet orchard in a gray light that was not yet morning. Barleycorn, she thought, as she came out under the last of the apple trees, had not followed her. He had stayed with the doors. He had, in some measure her father would have understood, been left in charge. By the time Susan reached the smithy, the lamps of Renfield were being put out one by one, and Bram Folks was at the anvil in his leather apron, working a horseshoe cold to straighten a bend. He looked up once at her wet shawl and her muddied hem and the tin box still under her arm, and he set the shoe down and drew her a cup of the tea kept always on the hob. He asked her no questions. She drank the tea. She said only, "There is a mark," and he nodded as though the sentence completed a thought of his own, and told her to sleep an hour before the town was awake. She slept. When she woke, the light in the little upper room was the pale yellow of a washed morning, and Bram had left on the table a wedge of bread, a piece of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and a small hammer with a claw at one end, and a handle worn to the shape of a hand. It had been her father's. Susan had last seen it in his coat pocket the winter he died. Bram had kept it. He had set it out beside the bread as another man might set out a psalter. Susan ate the bread. She wrapped the hammer in the cloth with the cheese and put it into her bundle. Then she went down to the smithy and told Bram, in as few words as she could manage, what she meant to do. She would go up to the hall by day, she said, and offer herself for work. Not for wages. For any small labor Mrs. Halden would grant her. The scrubbing of the servants' passage, the beating of the hall rugs, the clearing of the laundry court, in exchange only for her keep and the right to sleep in the outbuildings until her name was cleared. Mrs. Halden, she was certain, would refuse. Mr. Roderick, she was almost as certain, would allow it, for the pleasure of watching her on her knees where the whole village could see. And once she was inside the walls by day, with a bucket and a brush and a reason to be there, she could go down to the cellar at dusk without a coal chute and without a lantern shuttered to a slit. Bram listened with his cap in his hands. When she had finished, he said, "They will spit on you." "Yes," Susan said, "and you will kneel to it." "Yes." Bram put his cap back on his head. "Your father," he said, "would have done the same." She went that morning. She walked up the lane in her mended boots with her bundle over her arm and the tin box hidden beneath her cot in the smithy loft, since she would not carry it into the hall a second time. At the servants' door she asked for Mrs. Halden and stood in the rain until Mrs. Halden came. Mrs. Halden looked at her from the top step and laughed a short laugh through her nose. Mr. Roderick, coming down the passage behind his mother with a cup in his hand, heard the request and answered it before Mrs. Halden could refuse. "Let her scrub," he said. "Let the village see what an honest thief looks like on her knees." Mrs. Halden's mouth tightened. She handed Susan a bucket. For 4 days Susan worked. She scrubbed the servants' passage from the scullery door to the boot-room door on her knees with a brush that took the skin from 2 knuckles by the end of the first afternoon. She beat the hall rugs in the laundry court until her arms shook and the dust hung in the wet air like smoke. She cleared the drain in the yard that had been choked with 3 seasons of leaves. She carried coal up the back stair to the housekeeper's room and down again with the empty scuttle. She ate what was left on the kitchen table after the servants had eaten, standing, and slept in the disused henhouse at the end of the kitchen garden on a bed of clean straw Bram had sent up by a boy without a word to anyone. She spoke to no one. When the new footman, passing her in the passage, said, "Mind the christening cup, Mason," she did not lift her head. When the housekeeper, watching her scrub, said, "You missed there," Susan wet her brush again and went over the flag a second time. When Mrs. Halden came down the back stair in her taffeta and stepped deliberately across the wet flags Susan had just finished, Susan waited until she had passed and then scrubbed the flags again. Her hands taught her first. On the second afternoon, carrying coal down the back stair, she felt through the sole of her boot a hollow beneath a particular tread, the 4th from the bottom, that no other tread gave. On the 3rd morning, dusting the passage above the plate room, she noticed that the wainscoting behind the housekeeper's chair had been repapered within the last year, though nothing else in the passage had been touched in 10. On the 3rd evening, going out to the henhouse with her supper in her apron, she saw by the light of the scullery window that the lock on the plate room door was new, a bright brass ward set into darkened oak, and that the old lock had been prized out, and the wood beneath it clumsily filled with putty and painted over. She had polished that old lock every Saturday for 7 years. She had known the maker's mark on its face. She said nothing. She carried her supper to the henhouse and ate it in the dark. On the 4th day, scrubbing the flags of the laundry court, she came up hard against a stone that rocked under her brush. It was set into the paving where the coal chute path came out of the orchard wall, and it rocked only 1/4 of an inch. But a paving stone should not rock at all. Susan set her brush aside, sat back on her heels, and looked at the stone as though it were a face she had known long ago. Then she scrubbed it, and the flags around it, and moved on down the yard. That evening, in the last of the light, she took her father's hammer from her bundle in the henhouse, wrapped it again in the cloth, and slid it into the deep pocket of her apron beneath her shawl. She waited until the Haldens had gone in to dinner and the dogs had been chained. Then she went by the laundry court, and by the coal chute path, and by the little door in the ivy down into the cellar for the 2nd time. Barleycorn was on the deal table, waiting. He had not, she thought, moved from the room in 4 days. Susan set the lantern on the deal table beside the cat and opened the shutter to a full hand's width. The cellar looked older by this light than it had by the coin's slit. The vaults blacker, the flags more uneven, the 5 oak doors along the wall standing shoulder to shoulder like witnesses. She did not go to the doors. She went to the brick with the S and the M cut into it. She laid her palm flat against the letters. The brick was cold. She pressed with her thumb along the mortar around it, and found that on 3 sides the mortar was old, gritted, hard as the brick itself, but along the bottom edge it was softer, almost powdery, and gave up a little dust when she rubbed. She took the hammer from her apron, unwrapped it, and turned the claw end toward the brick. She worked the claw into the soft mortar as her father had once shown her, on a summer afternoon when she was 9, and he had been mending a step in the kitchen garden wall. He had said then that mortar told you where a man had been. She had not remembered the sentence in 12 years. The brick came out in one piece into her hand. Behind it was a cavity no bigger than a loaf, lined with a scrap of oilskin folded twice. Susan set the brick on the deal table and lifted the oilskin out. It was heavier than it looked. She unwrapped it on the table beside the tin box, slowly, the way her mother had once unwrapped a christening gown for her to see. Inside were 3 things: a small iron key with a filed ward, black with old oil, a folded packet of papers tied with brown thread, and a leather book no bigger than a prayer book, its cover rubbed pale at the corners, with her father's initials burnt into the spine. Susan sat down on the bench. Barleycorn came from the table and pressed his side against her knee. She untied the thread on the packet first, because her hands would not yet touch the book. The papers were her father's hand. She knew the shape of his capitals before she read a word. The top sheet was a list, dated 4 winters back, of every piece of household silver at Halden Hall, with the maker's marks written beside each in his careful copperplate. The sugar tongs, the 2 salt spoons, the christening cup, the snuff box, the small figured ladle, 6 pieces circled in a fainter ink. Beside each circled piece in the margin, a single word: pledged. Beneath the list was a second sheet, longer, in the same hand. It named a merchant in the next county who had taken plate from Halden Hall on 3 occasions between the previous Michaelmas and Candlemas, against sums advanced to Mr. Roderick Halden for debts her father did not itemize but numbered. It gave the dates. It gave the sums. It gave the receipts, folded small, 3 of them, each signed by the merchant and countersigned in a hand Susan knew from 100 household lists. Mr. Roderick's, looped and impatient at the tail. Beneath the receipts was a letter, sealed, addressed on the outside in her father's hand to Susan Mason, to be opened when they came for her name. She opened it. It was short. He had known, he wrote, for 2 years before he died, that Mr. Roderick was pledging plate against gaming losses in the county town, and that Mrs. Halden knew and had chosen to know nothing more. He had spoken to Mr. Roderick once in the library, and had been told to hold his tongue or lose his place, and had held his tongue because a steward without a place could not keep a daughter. He had begun then to keep the list and the receipts and this key, which fitted the 3rd of the 5 cupboard doors along the cellar wall. He wrote that when the plate room was found short, they would look for a small hand to blame, and that the smallest hand in the house was hers. He wrote that he was sorry to have left her to find this alone. He wrote that a person's name was a lamp, and that she was to light hers with what he had put by. Susan read the letter twice. Then she folded it, laid it on the oilskin, and took up the key. The 3rd door opened without complaint. Inside, on a shelf of plain deal, wrapped each in a square of green baize, lay 6 pieces of silver. The sugar tongs, the 2 salt spoons, the christening cup with its dented rim she had straightened at 15, the snuff box, the small figured ladle. Beside them, in a canvas bag, a 4th receipt, dated a month after her father's death, in Mr. Roderick's hand alone, for the plate held by the merchant, redeemed, and returned to the hall in secret, and hidden here in the cellar her father had kept locked, because Mr. Roderick had not dared put them back on the plate-room shelves, for fear the housekeeper would notice they had ever been gone. He had put them instead behind a door only the dead steward had a key to, and had waited for the day he might blame their absence on someone he could turn out. Susan stood with the christening cup in her hand and did not weep. She wrapped the 6 pieces again in their bays, laid them back on the shelf, closed the door, and turned the key. She put the key, the papers, and the letter into the tin box at last, snapping the rusted lock closed over them with the heel of the hammer. Then she sat on the bench with the box against her ribs and barleycorn heavy against her thigh, and she listened to the house above her breathe. She had come for her name, and her name was on the shelf behind the door. She meant to be out of the cellar before midnight, back through the coal chute and across the wet orchard to the smithy, with the tin box under her shawl and the letter next to her skin. She did not reach the chute. Above her, in the passage 2 floors up, a bell rang out of hour, and then a second bell, and then a woman's voice raised sharp enough to carry down through brick and flag. Feet ran on the back stair. Susan shuttered the lantern to a thread and stood still against the cellar wall. Somewhere above, a door slammed, and then another, and then she smelled it. Faint at first through the coal chute passage, then unmistakable. Smoke. Not the honest smoke of a coal grate, but the black, oily smoke of wool and old timber taking flame. She thought at once of the hen house, of the straw Bram had sent, of the lantern she had left trimmed low on its nail by the door. She had not lit it that evening. She was certain she had not lit it. She was certain, and then less certain, and then it did not matter, because the smoke was already thickening in the chute. Susan pushed the tin box deep into the cavity behind the brick, wedged the loose brick back into place, and took only the letter, folded small, inside her bodice against her skin. Then she went up the cellar stair, not by the chute, but by the inner stair her father had used, the one that came out behind the housekeeper's pantry. Because there were people in the house, and she had heard a child's voice among the running feet, and the smoke was coming from the west wing where the nursery had been reopened that autumn for Mrs. Halden's sister's 2 little girls. She came out into the passage in her wet apron with her father's hammer in her hand and the smoke rolling low along the ceiling. The housekeeper was in the passage in her nightdress with a candle, staring at the west wing door, not moving. Mrs. Halden was on the stair above shouting for water. Mr. Roderick was nowhere. Susan pushed past the housekeeper without a word, wrapped her shawl over her mouth, and went into the wing. She found the 2 little girls in the night nursery under the window, the elder holding the younger, both barefoot, both coughing. The curtains along the far wall were burning in a thin, bright line where a lamp had been overturned on a chest. Susan gathered the younger onto her hip, took the elder by the wrist, and brought them out the way she had come, down the back stair, through the scullery, into the wet air of the laundry court. She set them on the mounting block by the pump. She went back for the nurse, whom she found on her knees in the passage choking on smoke, and half carried her out beside the children. She went back a 3rd time for a canvas fire bucket she had seen hanging by the boot-room door and threw it on the curtains, and then a 2nd, and then a 3rd. And by the time Bram Folks and 2 of the Carters were up the lane with buckets from the pump, the fire in the nursery was a wet black patch on a wall and nothing more. Susan stood in the laundry court in a soaked apron with soot on her face and her hair loose down her back. Mrs. Halden came down into the yard in her taffeta and her nightdress at once, and did not look at her. Mr. Roderick came at last from the direction of the stables, saw the children safe on the mounting block, saw Susan behind them with the empty bucket in her hand, and stopped in the wet gravel as though a hand had been laid against his chest. The elder of the 2 little girls, who was perhaps 6, slid off the mounting block and went to Susan and put her arms around Susan's waist and would not let go. Susan looked at Mr. Roderick over the child's head. She did not speak. She had the letter against her skin and the 6 pieces of silver behind a locked door in her father's cellar and a small girl's arms around her waist. and she had chosen, in the smoke, without thinking, and could not have chosen otherwise. She understood then that the choosing had been made for her a long time ago, in a kitchen garden, by a man showing his daughter how mortar told you where a man had been. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the laundry court smelled of wet ash. Bram Folks had set the two little girls in blankets on a bench in the scullery. The nurse was sitting on a stool with a cup between her hands, and one of the carters had gone down the lane on his cob to fetch the doctor from the far side of the parish. Mrs. Halden had gone in to her sister and had not come out. Mr. Roderick stood in the wet gravel with his hands at his sides and did not move to help. Susan disengaged the elder girl's arms gently, set her on the mounting block again, and told Bram she needed a witness. She did not tell him yet what for. Bram nodded, gave the reins of his patience to her, and followed. Susan walked to the cellar door in the outer wall, the small ivy-covered one, and took him in by the way she had come. In the vault beneath the barred window, she showed him the marked brick, drew out the tin box she had wedged back into the cavity a few hours before, and, with her father's hammer, sprang the rusted lock a second time and laid the papers on the deal table under the lantern. Bram, who could read plain sums but not copperplate, put his finger on the first receipt and asked her only, "Is that his hand?" Susan said, "It is." Bram straightened, took off his cap and said, "Then we send for the vicar and the constable both." The vicar came before the doctor did. His name was Mr. Alwyn Prendergast, a small, tidy man with ink under his thumbnail, who had known Susan's father for 20 years and had christened Susan in the church at the top of the lane. He read the list in the cellar, then the receipts, then the letter, standing very still with the lantern at his elbow. When he had finished, he folded the letter along its old crease, handed it back to Susan, and said, "Your father was a careful man. You will keep this on your person until the magistrate has seen it." Susan said she would. He asked to see the third door. She turned the key. He looked at the 6 pieces of green baize on the deal shelf without lifting them, counted them, and said quietly, "Sugar tongs, salt spoons, christening cup, snuff box, ladle. Yes." He closed the door, gave Susan the key, and said, "Come up into the house now. Do not walk behind me. Walk beside me." They walked up the inner stair together, Bram behind them with his cap in his hand. Mr. Roderick was in the library with the fire not yet lit, still in the coat he had ridden in from the stables. The vicar laid the papers on the writing table between them, one at a time, in order, and said very little. Mr. Roderick read the first sheet, and the second, and the third, and then sat down in his father's chair and put his face in his hands. He did not deny it. He said only, "I meant to put them back." The vicar said, "You did not." Mr. Roderick said, "No." Mrs. Halden was sent for. When the letter was read to her, she did not weep either. She said in a low voice that she had known and had not known, which the vicar accepted without comment. She looked once at Susan across the writing table and said, "I ask your pardon." Susan inclined her head and said, "It is given." She said nothing more. The vicar wrote out a plain statement of the facts in his own hand and asked Mr. Roderick to sign it, which he did, and asked Mrs. Halden to witness it, which she did. Then he folded the sheet twice and put it into his coat pocket for the magistrate. By the time the doctor arrived for the children and the nurse, half the village was in the lane. Word had come down with the carter and had gone from door to door in the way word goes in Renfield. The chandler's wife was at the gate with a basket of bread. The egg woman had come up in her clogs with a jug of milk for the little girls. The girl of 12, who had hidden her face in her mother's shawl in the square, stood at the yard wall now and would not be hurried away. When Susan came out of the front door of Halden Hall beside the vicar, in her soaked apron, with soot still on her cheek, the lane went quiet in the way a market goes quiet, and then the chandler's wife took a step forward and said, "Susan." No one laughed. The egg woman crossed herself again, this time for a different reason, and the girl of 12 came through the gate and gave Susan the ribbon out of her own hair without speaking. Mrs. Ainsley, the retired schoolmistress, was at the churchyard wall on her 2 sticks with her boy beside her. She did not come forward. When Susan passed her on the way down the lane, Mrs. Ainsley only nodded once, as she had nodded in the square, and Susan understood at last what the old woman had said to her by the market cross. What was locked below had outlived what was polished above. Susan bent her head to the schoolmistress and went on. That week the magistrate came out from the county town, read the papers in the vicarage parlor, spoke privately with Mr. Roderick for an hour, and left again without any man being taken away in irons. What passed between them was not reported in Renfield, but the 6 pieces of silver were brought up out of the cellar in daylight and set back on the plate-room shelves in the sight of the housekeeper, and the debts to the merchant in the next county were paid out of the sale of a strip of pasture along the north wall, and Mr. Roderick was seen at church the following Sunday, sitting in the family pew with his head bent through the sermon. He did not look at Susan across the aisle. When the service ended, he stopped her at the porch in front of the village and said, "Miss Mason, I did you a great wrong." Susan said, "You did." He said, "I shall not undo it by speaking." She said, "No, only by living." He bowed to her and went out into the churchyard, and the village let him pass. Mrs. Halden asked Susan to come back to the hall as housekeeper in her own right, at proper wages, with the little room above the still room that had been her mother's before she married. Susan thanked her and refused. She took instead the offer the vicar made her a week later on behalf of the parish, to keep the small schoolroom above the vestry where Mrs. Ainsley had taught her letters 12 years before. Mrs. Ainsley had asked for her by name. Susan moved her bundle and her mother's comb and the prayer book with the softened spine out of the smithy loft and up the lane to the 2 rooms behind the vestry. And Barleycorn, who had come out of the cellar the morning after the fire and followed her down the orchard path on his stiff legs, came with her and slept on the hearth. By the end of that winter, Susan was teaching 9 children their letters in the low room above the vestry, and by spring there were 14. She kept her father's small claw hammer on the mantel over the schoolroom fire, and the tin box, with its rusted lock now truly broken, on the shelf beneath it, and inside the tin box the letter, folded along its old crease that had told her a person's name, was a lamp. On fine evenings, she walked down through the churchyard to the little iron cross where her grandfather lay, and stood a moment with her hand on the top of the yew gate, and went home before the light went. On a Sunday in late May, a year almost to the day since she had walked down the lane between the dripping hedgerows with a tin box under her arm, Susan sat on the low wall outside the schoolroom in the last hour of the sun. The hedgerows were in full leaf. The hay was standing in the far field. Bram Folks was leaning in the smithy door at the bottom of the lane with his cap in his hand, watching the light. The elder of the 2 little girls from the nursery, who came up the lane most Sundays now to sit with Susan and read a page, was beside her on the wall with a book open on her knee and barleycorn heavy across her feet. The child asked Susan what she had done, in the end, that had made everything come right. Susan looked down the lane at the roofs of Renfield gone gold in the low light, and at the smoke rising thin and straight from Bram's forge, and at the churchyard yew above the wall, and thought a moment before she answered. "I kept a lamp lit," she said, that my father set down." The child did not quite understand, and put her head against Susan's shoulder, and Susan let her stay. The bell in the church tower rang the hour, and the shadows lengthened across the lane, and the day went quietly out over Renfield, the way a good day goes. Thank you for staying with Susan to the end of her long road home, and for sitting with a story about the patience it takes to keep a name lit when the world tries to blow it out. If this quiet corner of Renfield moved you, do leave a like, tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and subscribe so you are with us for the next story we set down by the fire.